the first thing that needs to be said is that government is God's servant.
And welcome to Off the Cuff. My name's Joe Gormley. I'm here with Pastor Jeff Clearware, and we are here again to bring you culturally relevant eisegesis or exegesis. What are we doing?
Well, okay, so we're going to exegete the culture, draw out from what's happening, and rightly diagnose. And then we're going to take our exegesis of the text and see that through the biblical lens.
Good. I'm glad you explained that because we had some questions. Actually, we're very excited that we did. Last week we got everything out there. We put out 4 podcasts, and we've got more recorded. But we're probably going to put this one out because of the timing. We have things going on in the culture that we want to discuss. Specifically, something that happened in Iowa.
Right.
There was a few Satanists, if you want to call them Satanists. They're Satanists that don't want to be called Satanists.
They're social justice warriors that are pretending to worship a Satan they don't believe in.
Right.
In order to do something like say, hey, we can have our statue too, kind of thing.
Because they want to have a positive impact. They don't want to be negative. They don't want to be atheists.
Right. Not
theists, because it's atheist, meaning no, and theist meaning God. So they don't want to be no God.
Yeah.
So they want to be something.
Yeah, because if they're just atheists, that's boring. They're just like against something that they don't even believe in.
Right.
But if they could be Satanists, then they have some crazy agenda or some rituals and traditions and incantations or whatever they're going to do.
Yeah, so this brings some kind of positivity to their platform because they want to be
Isaiah
positive.
5:20, up is down, down is up. That's positive
there
to
you
them.
Go.
Yeah.
There you go. So apparently they put up a statue in Iowa, and we had a man by the name of Michael Cassidy who said, No, that is not allowed in my town.
And he tore the thing's head off and stuffed it in a trash can.
How about that? What do you think about that? Was he doing God's will, or was he going against God's will?
So I think the intuition of every Christian just rightly identifies that as good.
Okay.
Like, I think you just know, right? Like when you know that there's a Satan statue in the State House.
Right.
And a Christian man tears the head off the thing and stuffs in the trash. How does a Christian not cheer that?
Yeah.
Like, intuitively, we know that that's not the meaning of freedom.
Right.
The freedom to erect Satan statues. We know that, but then you sort of have to back off for a second. What's our epistemology?
Yeah. How do we know?
How do we know? Like, how can we justify this belief?
Yeah. So, and when we try to apply an epistemology that's not biblical, maybe where else do we get epistemologies? Where do we learn how we know something?
Yeah, a lot of people don't think about that. You know, epistemology is the study of how we know. And for the Christian, our conscience is held captive by the Word of God. So we have a standard. This is our rule of faith. Now, all people have the ability to reason. But that's more or less perverted in the mind of people. So reason actually is an epistemology. You can't even know what the Bible says unless you can read.
Yeah.
Unless you have the reasoning faculty to understand language.
Yeah.
So these two things are not against each other. And so there's this general revelation which includes reason, and that's built into man. But then you have the specific revelation of Scripture which will help us answer questions like this.
I love to talk about rabbit trails that we're not going to go down today, but just for a future thought. So I was watching Bonson and Sproul debate on how to do apologetics. Right? And I couldn't figure out the difference between them. This is why I call myself Average Joe, right? Because I don't, I mean, I listen to this stuff, but I don't really get it. To me, presuppositionalist apologetics and evidentiary apologetics is two birds of the same feather, or
I think there's differences, but I would be on the R.C. Sproul side of that. In that particular debate,
I'd probably be on the Bonson side, but not necessarily because I disagree with either one of them. I think they're both great. I think I'd go with both. I'd load both guns. You know?
Yeah, and there's times when I'm witnessing where I'll pull the Bonson, you know, and just by what standard? You know, just because I'm going to deconstruct their worldview and show how incoherent it is.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that I'm a full-on
right.
presuppositionalist.
And that's a whole other show, which I think will be awesome.
It'll be great.
To talk about that. But it goes back to epistemology and how do we know stuff, right? So how do we know if tearing down a statue of Satan is wrong?
Right, and we're Christians here, right? And our audience is for Christians.
Right, nobody's going to argue that just from a Christian perspective, but how do we, let me ask this, how do we get into a wrong epistemology?
Well, let's just take this particular case study.
Okay.
And I'll show you kind of how I think it's objectively right that he tore that statue down. You have to begin with your worldview of that there is a God, right? And from general revelation, Romans 1 teaches us you can know that much, that there is a God in heaven, right? And that he has revealed himself. Classical apologetics would appeal to the evidence of the resurrection and the prophecies fulfilled and the miracles that Jesus did. All of these things point that God has revealed himself in the Bible. But so as far as epistemology goes, this is our standard, and we have to ask the question, all right, what role has God given government? And in the New Testament, you probably have two preeminent texts there, right? Romans 13, 1 Peter 2.
Right.
The first thing that needs to be said is that government is God's servant. Romans 13:4. Okay.
Romans 13, you said, is a deacon of God?
Romans 13:4. The government itself, a governor, is God's deacon, his servant. So diakonos in the Greek. And this servant of God is delegated authority from the absolute authority of God. So there's only the absolute authority of God. Now, if you go to this atheistic worldview where there is no God, then what's the highest power in the universe? Well, it defaults to government. Government takes that role as the highest power, but that's the wrong worldview.
Right.
It's wrong starting point.
Right.
Puts humanism, man at the center.
We have to have a standard.
Yeah. Now, the second important text is 1 Peter 2, where we're to be subject to these human institutions, whether to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Punish and praise.
So if they're not doing punishing and praising,
right. So
they're outside of God's will? Is that what you're saying?
And the role of government actually there is very limited. So we're getting this limited role of government from the Bible. And to limit the power of government is to set people free, right? So freedom is actually coming from here. Why is that so limited? Because the governor is going to bear the sword, Romans 13.
Right.
The use of a sword to initiate force, to force or compel someone, has to reach a very high standard. In other words, if somebody murders, he should fear because the governor will hold a sword against them, and they're going to take your life for taking someone else's. And so the governor can rightly deter crime. That's police, military. That's a proper role for government. But can a governor say, I am going to compel you to pay taxes in order to meet the need of someone who has less? Marxism, right?
Right.
How can you use the sword? You have to be willing to back up your taxes with jail time or whatever the punishment is going to be, which you can't justify that from the Bible. So you can't justify so much of what the government does in our culture because they're backing it up by the sword. You can't compel people with the sword. Now, conversely, you say, well, aren't they also supposed to reward the good? It doesn't say in 1 Peter, reward the good. It says, praise the good.
Praise.
That's very different.
Yes.
Than extracting money by the edge of the sword.
And stealing.
And stealing. So, but we're not actually here getting into like welfare and whatnot. I bring it up because the government does have a rightful role to commend what is good. And they can say, yeah, we're going to have a Christmas tree in the Iowa Capitol.
Because that's good.
Because it's good. And where do they get that understanding of good?
From the Bible.
Yes.
Historically, we do.
Yeah.
But Now, our current culture wants to argue that we don't get that from the Bible, that we get that from some sort of social convention or social agreement, some sort of social covenant, even if they want to use that language. But
and what's your big word, like solipsis or something like that that you taught me?
Solipsistic.
Solipsistic. That's when you're like looking through the lens of your own time and thinking that's the only standard, and because you're so used to it.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So that's how people are today, thinking that what we view as liberty and the role of government is just the way it always was, when it's not. Mm-hmm. That's like the 1950s onward, the Supreme Court decisions. Let's back it up earlier, not be solipsistic, and say, how did the Supreme Court view this nation in 1892?
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the case?
No, which one?
Holy Trinity versus the United States. All right, so there was a law passed maybe 5 years earlier in the late 1880s.
Is this with public school?
No.
Oh.
This was about bringing in labor. You couldn't contract to bring an immigrant in to work for you. Well, there was a church, Holy Trinity, in New York, that contracted an Anglican preacher to come and fill their pulpit. And the law said no. And this got chased all the way up to the Supreme Court. You can't contract to bring him in. And the ruling, the lower court ruling, was overturned by the entire Supreme Court. On what basis? Well, they argued some on intent. Like, it wasn't intended to target, like, intellectual labor. It was more for, manual labor.
Right.
But then the second part of the argument was so important. They said, this is a Christian nation.
Yes.
And in explicit terms, they said that this is a religious nation. And they cited the oath. They cited the Declaration, of Independence, appealing to God. They cited that every constitution of the states was decidedly Christian.
In fact, the states, at the writing of the Constitution, all had an official religion for the state.
Yeah.
Whether or not they had religious tolerance or religious freedom.
But what about the First Amendment? Didn't that overturn that?
Well, it kind of says that the First Amendment's really for that loosely held federalism that we set
So what
up.
is the First Amendment? Congress shall not impose.
Correct.
So at the national federal level, there's not going to be an establishment of religion, and there's never to be prohibiting the free exercise of religion.
Right.
So in Iowa today, what does their constitution say?
I don't know what the Iowa Constitution
The
says.
first line appeals to the supreme being.
Wow.
The creator, and refers to him as the basis for everything that follows. In Iowa to this day.
Wow.
So what happened in Iowa, the lawlessness, was not Michael Cassidy who tore the thing down.
Right.
It was the lawlessness of erecting a Baphomet in the House, in the state chamber. This was lawlessness on the part of those people who did that. The highest authority there is their Constitution.
And their Constitution specifically cites a dedication to
the supreme
Jesus
being.
Christ.
It says supreme being there.
Okay.
Ruler of the universe kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So just and this was actually dealt with early on in the states very often. So there was a case that the 1892 decision appeals to, which is that Pennsylvania, I think that might have been involving. Was it that Supreme Court justice? No, it was Keene. It wasn't. We talked about Joseph's story.
No.
It wasn't. He was earlier.
Yeah.
But there was the Supreme Court recognized in 1892. They recognized that Pennsylvania was a Christian commonwealth, and other ones were explicitly. But what they would say is it's generally Christian. Right. So the whole thing of what the sectarian concern, it was that, and they talk about this in the decision. It wasn't the difference between. They'll mention Mohammedism and the Dalai Lama and say it's not to make room for that, but for the sectarian differences between Baptists and the Methodists and the Anglicans and Congregationalists, that we're not going to have a religious test.
Well, it sounds to me like your big concern from an epistemological standpoint is how are we learning these things? Why do we even question that pulling down a statue of Satan could be wrong?
Right, because so what's happened then in the 1950s, like the Supreme Court decisions to throw prayer out of school, And then following along with...
How do we let that happen? I wasn't here.
Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't there either. And then in 1973, Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
I
was born in 68, thank you.
They're redefining what was meant by the Constitution and by the early documents to be this radical liberalism.
Right.
And that liberalism, there's a difference between liberty and liberalism.
Yeah.
And this liberalism that's come up since the 1950s and 1960s is making the right to be unencumbered, completely autonomous, as this high value that kind of overrides everything. So your right to your own sexual identity or this, or to make yourself whatever gender you want to be, or to have any religious thing that you want to do, all of these things have to be protected as the highest value in the culture.
So we took the Christian definition of liberty and we imposed maybe the French definition of liberty on top of it.
Yeah, the French Revolution, which is, what's their definition?
Their definition of liberty is everything. It's libertarian, it's libertine.
Yes.
It's everything is at your disposal. There are no limits. There are no standard. There is no standard by which we live. And how much of a problem if we can't have a standard?
Yeah.
What's going to happen next in our culture?
So the standard that the Constitution recognizes is the biblical standard.
Right.
That government actually is to be exceptionally small and do very little. It is to bear the sword. So to deter these major crimes. It's not to be like this parent in society.
The nanny state.
Yeah, the nanny state. It's not to be all those things. So Christianity gives us this liberty, and it took time, because if you think about the Reformation, right? Martin Luther was very big on Romans 13 because he was cracking down on a peasants' revolt that happened. And so the role of government, obey your rulers, kind of like in all things. Meanwhile, in the time of Martin Luther, they had a Baptist locked up in the tower.
An Anabaptist?
An Anabaptist, yes.
Right.
So Martin Luther is doing great things, but simultaneously his political theory is very undeveloped at that time in history.
Right.
This poor man, Fritz Erba, is locked in darkness inside of a tower and just being thrown food and for like 7 years.
That reminds me.
For nothing other than his baptism. He refused to baptize his children. So it hadn't developed yet. Let me just follow this train of thought, and then don't forget what you want to remind us of. But so you have a development of understanding. From Calvin's Institutes in his last section, the last aphorisms, he talks about lesser magistrates interposing when there's tyranny. John Knox takes that to Scotland, and the Scottish jurisprudence develops from that. You get Blackstone and Witherspoon. Witherspoon is the one who trains James Madison, who comes up with the separation of powers, that you'd have three branches of government, and in the legislature there's this bicameral situation based on population. Where does he get that? He's trained at Princeton by John Witherspoon.
Wow.
In the Scottish common sense, in this biblical ethic. Listen to this. There was a study done by Donald Lutz, and he went back and traced the quotes of the founding fathers from, I think it's 1760 until 1805. And it's just this vast study of all the literature of their writing. And he isolated whenever something was cited, quoted from. 1/3 of all the quotations came from the Bible in their political writings.
Wow.
1/3.
That's great.
The next after that was Montesquieu. But Montesquieu had less quotes than Deuteronomy. Just the book of Deuteronomy. And then John Locke is after Montesquieu.
Okay.
And John Locke has like half as much as the book of Deuteronomy. And then after that is, somebody else. I don't know. I guess Blackstone would probably be the third. But the point is, the Bible formed the jurisprudence of the country.
Yeah.